we get down to the water and we want to launch the boat, the person that's reversing the car back, what they'll do is they'll double check the tie downs are off, the drain plug's in, we go to reverse the boat back. As we're reversing back, it's important to get the boat as straight to the water as possible without sort of skewing around too much, because we won't have any control over the boat and where it's heading until it's completely in the water and we can steer the boat. So it's important the final into the water on the trailer is facing the way that you actually want to go into the water. When I'm going back, I'm looking into my mirrors, and a lot of people will tell you to rely on the height of the guard for the right depth to put the boat into the water. That's a pretty good idea, but I find the most effective way is to actually run the side of the hull. So when you're watching in your mirrors, when the water's lapping just here, I know it guarantees me X amount of depth, so that's 600 mil. With the guards, it depends on the steepness of the ramp. So on a really nice steep ramp, the guards might be half submerged to get to this depth, but on a really shallow ramp, especially inland, you might find the guard might be completely submerged to get to that depth. In both scenarios, the water's lapping here, but the guard height's totally different. So I like to go off the back of the hull with my guaranteed depth rather than where the guard is, depending on the steepness of the ramp. I find that the best way to go about it. When we get down to the ramp, just to reiterate on that, at the front we have our winch strap. That's going to stay secure till we're ready to launch the boat. Before we actually launch the boat, we're going to take the tie downs off, put the drain plug in, make sure our transducer's in the correct position. In a lot of instances, we'll also have some sort of motor support for the motor when it's in towing mode. So what we'll have here on the passenger side of the boat is what we call a power trim and tilt button. So this button makes the motor go up and down, and there'll be one of these here and one of these on the control box. So with this motor, we trim the motor up a little bit, and we have a little rubber block that's inside here at the moment. We'll remove this, and that's the thing that's been supporting the motor while it's been in transit. So we'll take this out prior to putting the boat into the water. We will leave the motor in an upright position like this until the boat's in the water and ready to be actually ran, just so we've got maximum clearance. But in this instance, we're actually going to put the motor down for the moment. And the reason why is when we get inside the boat and start talking about operating the actual motor, I'm going to talk about how deep the motor has to be in the water before we start it. So if the boat was in the water right now and we wanted to start the motor, what I like to make sure of is this plate here, which is what we call our cavitation plate. If this is in the water, I'll have sufficient depth to start the motor safely and comfortably so it's getting correct water pressure through the motor. What we're looking for is this plate here to be fully submerged. This is what we call our impeller, and that's the part that picks up the water and keeps the motor at an operating temperature to keep the motor running. So if this plate's in the water, we're sweet. What we'll be looking for is what they call the telltale, which is the outlet of the water for the motor, which will be squirting at the side here. And a bit of a rule of thumb for me is the quieter the motor is, the better the water pressure. You might find if the motor's up a little bit, you'll hear like an aerating sort of sound, and the exhaust is almost out of the water and the motor's a little bit noisier. As we trim down, the motor will get quieter and quieter and quieter. So once we're ready to actually start the motor, we'll have the motor down into this position. But prior to putting the actual boat into the water, and we're still on the trailer, we still want to keep the motor up so we've got maximum clearance for the hull. So what we'll do is we'll go over here. And at the back of the boat, we have a battery switch. This is that isolation switch directly connected to the battery. So when we're not using the boat's in storage, it has an arrow with on or off written on it. We'll make sure this is always off, so there's no power being drawn from the battery while the boat's in storage. But when we want to actually use the boat and take it out, nothing will work until we flick this battery switch on. So that's one of the first things we'll have to do prior to starting the motor. We'll have a water separator here. This is more of a maintenance thing. And what this does is we have, in this particular boat, we have an underfloor fuel tank. And this will check the fuel before it goes to the motor through a filter for a water separator. So if there's any water inside the actual fuel, This will identify that before it goes to the motor. So it's a service part, but if they're ever talking about the water separator, that's what that is. Motors always have a primer ball on them, which will pump the fuel out of the tank and into the motor. This was a lot more important on carbureted motors, especially ones that we used to choke to start. These days the motors are fuel injected, so it's not as important as what it was. If you have a portable fuel tank though, so like a 24 litre fuel tank and a smaller boat, when you connect the fuel to the hose, it doesn't hurt to give that a quick pump, and you'll actually feel the fuel go through it. But the underfloor fuel tanks that are fuel injected motors, it's not really that necessary anymore. So our battery switch is now on. Primer ball, we're giving a few pumps, but it's not that necessary. Water separator's all sweet, and that's something we'll check at servicing. Get into our fuel, which is this guy here. You do want to make sure that you're aware the first time you use the boat what side your fuel filler's on in the car. So mine's the driver's side in this instance. When I'm driving, I know I've got to pull up on this side of the Bowser. Your fuel filler is very similar to the car. It's a breathable fuel tank, so there's circulation of fresh air going through the fuel tank as it's getting filled up. So you shouldn't get that splashback sort of overflow sort of scenario. But just here is our breather for the fuel tank. So that's going to be circulating air as we're doing this, but we do want to make sure we don't overfill the fuel tank when we go out boating, especially on those really hot days where the fuel might expand a little bit. Because if it's ever going to come out of anywhere, the fuel will pour out of this little guy here, especially on those really, really hot days. So we don't need to fill the fuel tank up to the brim. What we do is we undo this guy here, the top cap, get our 91 octane. So this standard unleaded fuel. We don't use ethanol fuel, and in this instance, we don't need to use high octane fuel unless your owner's manual specifies to do so. In this particular scenario, it's just a 91 octane. We try and get the nozzle facing directly down the hose, so it's not hitting the side of the hose as such. And I like to get the first 5 or 10 litres of fuel in there at sort of half throttle. Once the fuel's going through there and it's circulating a little bit, then we can open the throttle up and get maximum fuel on board. But we typically fill it up to about 90% of its capacity. So if it's a 100 litre fuel tank and you know it's empty, 90 litres is all we sort of need. We don't need to fill it all the way up. And as I said, especially on those really hot days where the fuel might expand a little bit, it's not that necessary. The motors these days, like this 4-stroke 90 horsepower Yamaha, we're going to be getting somewhere between 2.5 and 4 kilometres of range for every litre that we use. So you put 100 litres in here, you're going to get between 250 and 400 kilometres in range, depending on your revs and everything. So you're not going to go through all that fuel in a day, and by not filling it up to the absolute brink, it's not going to let the fuel expand and come out of the breathers or anything. So the fuel goes in here. Now in your owner's manual, you'll see, you might wonder what those 2 holes are. There's actually a fitting you can buy. So if this ever got too tight from an airlock or it got a little bit stuck, there's a fitting that goes in here, and that'll wedge and pry it to open the fuel a little bit easier. It's just got to be nice and tight, but not over tight.